Hello, Tennessee, and thank you for joining us on this Labor Day evening. If you are paying attention at all and have ever read the Constitution, you know that federal overreach is out of control. Many obviously unconstitutional and outrageous policies and programs are a direct result of Supreme Court opinions. The court and its supporters claim the opinion of Marbury versus Madison in 1803 established the idea that the Supreme Court is the sole and final arbiter of what is constitutional or not. But is that accurate? What will happen if states don't stand up to restore their stolen sovereignty? What about our individual rights and freedoms? If our states won't intervene on our behalf, how long will we have any freedom left if we leave it up to the federal government? That and more tonight on the Tennessee Informer. Hello and welcome to the Tennessee Informer. Our topic tonight is federal overreach, specifically the impact of Marbury versus Madison and the usurpation that has led to, as well as many points made in the decision that actually support the fact that unconstitutional laws are null and void, and the fact that the decision actually undercuts the myth that all federal laws trump all state laws. We have been told repeatedly, including by our AG as well as others throughout the years, that all federal laws trump all state laws and that the Supreme Court is the final arbiter on all constitutional questions. That our only hope for reversing even the most egregious and absurd decision of a Supreme Court decision is another Supreme Court decision or an amendment to the Constitution. Before we talk about Marbury versus Madison, let's take a quick review of the pertinent facts. This was a political case. To give you a little bit of background for those of you who may not know, so this was 1803. Well, in 1800, the election of 1800, Thomas Jefferson was elected, and the Republican Democrat Party, as it was known at the time, took over. They replaced the Federalists. The Federalists were under John Adams, and in the election of 1800, Adams was defeated, Jefferson came in, and the Federalists were pretty much lost power everywhere. Now, prior to that, and let me just remind you, one of the things that led them to lose power was the Alien and Sedition Acts that were passed in 1798. And if you remember, we've talked about this on the show before, those acts were so overboard that led Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, although anonymously at the time, to write the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions protesting those acts. Now, they didn't get a lot of support at the time from other states, but later on, in fact, during the Jefferson administration, the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, what was established during those, what the things that were said in those were used by other states that basically ignored them and poo-pooed them when the Federalists were in power, and now that Jefferson was in power, they made good use of them. So anyhow, so 1800, Jefferson comes to power, the Federalists are out, and one of the things the Federalists did as they were leaving, you may have heard this, it's known as the midnight judges. So they passed laws late in the session after their defeat, but before they've handed over power, and they expanded the court. Okay, it wasn't per se court packing, but they did expand the court, got more Federalist judges in there with the hopes of being able to undercut things that the Jefferson administration might try to accomplish. Because you got to understand, you know, our founding fathers, all of our founding fathers, they definitely deserve to be on a pedestal for what they did in terms of freeing us from Britain, you know, the Declaration of Independence, the Revolution, and they all deserve our praise for that, and we have to appreciate them for that. But they were not on the same sheet. They did not all have the same idea of what our government should be like. And so by the time 1800 comes around, they're at odds. And to make things worse, we're in a little quasi-war with France at this time. You remember France, who'd been our ally during the Revolution. Well, the Federalists were more pro-British, and the Jeffersonian followers were more pro-French. And so you have all these things combining. It was a really acrimonious election, and each side saw the other side as a threat to the republic, okay? I mean, so any good feeling from the revolution towards each other was long gone by now, all right? So that's kind of the background. So the Federalists had did all these, created these different positions, filled all these different slots with judges. And one of the acts they did really late in the game, as it turned out, they were still, they had created more positions, and this happened to be this particular case involving Marbury. I think William Marbury was his name. They signed his commission. Now, he was not going to be a federal judge. He was going to be a judge in D.C., the newly created District of D.C. And his commission, along with a lot of others, were supposed to have been delivered the night prior. I mean, we're talking about the last day of the Adams administration before Jefferson took over. Well, as it turned out, Marbury and a few others did not get their commissions on time before Jefferson took over. Now, we're going to be talking in a minute about the actual case in which John Marshall was the Supreme Court Justice presiding over the case. Well, John Marshall was also he was Secretary of State for Adams. And for a while, he was both Secretary of State and a Supreme Court Justice. Well, he actually had a hand in the commissionings because he had to affix the stamp or make sure that everything was correct on the commission before it was sent out, before it was delivered to all of the different people that were appointed. So here he was in charge of these deliveries. So 1801, the next day comes by, Jefferson notices these commissions are undelivered. He tells Madison, hey, don't bother, we're not going to deliver them. And Marbury sues over this. He wants his commission. He was appointed, he was assigned, and he wants them. Well, Madison blew it off, Jefferson blew it off. I mean, there was a, it did make it to the Supreme Court. As a matter of fact, it went directly to the Supreme Court because of the nature of it. They didn't take it serious. They figured, okay, look, this is ridiculous. They didn't deliver it in time. We're not going to give it to them. And so that was the gist of the case. So Marbury versus Madison, the Madison was James Madison. Marbury was suing James Madison, and he wanted his commission that had been signed, approved and signed by the Adams Commission, which Marshall, the judge presiding over this, had failed to ensure he got delivered on time because they were trying to do all this at the last minute. And so Marshall he's the head guy in this case. He should have been a witness in the case, but he's the head guy in this case, and he's overseeing this. So just kind of keep that in mind. And so when it all came down, and I'm going to give you a quick synopsis, and then we're going to go over specific things that were said in the case that I think are relevant and that you need to know, because I think there's a lot of good things actually in this decision. The one thing that we always hear, if you ever do an internet search for Marbury versus Madison, or for John Marshall, or for judicial review, this case will pop up and it will say this was the case where Justice Marshall established judicial review for the Supreme Court, meaning that the court gets to review laws and make a decision on whether or not they're constitutional. That's how it's been interpreted. Well, number one, it was not actually the first case. They'd actually done that several years ago. But I want you to think about that and remember what I'm getting ready to tell you as I go through some of these other points. This was 15 years on, okay? So the election was 1800, the appointment came 1801, now we're 1803. They didn't have a Supreme Court session in 1802. Basically, the Jefferson administration, the legislature, they didn't allot for it some way, somehow. It did not happen. I don't remember all the details on that. I meant to look that up and get you better answers, but there wasn't one in 1802, so it came about in 1803. so 1789 was when our federal government started. 1787 you had the Constitution, finally approved. It had 9 members by 1788, and then it actually started in March of 1789. So here we are 12 years later, 13 years later, and they're saying that he's created judicial review. Well, that doesn't make sense. It was either in the Constitution or it wasn't in the Constitution. But just keep that in mind, and I think you'll see some things on that here in a little bit. Anyway, so the gist of the case was, or the way Marshall laid it out in the case was he entitled to this commission? He decided he was entitled. It was correctly signed. Obviously, Adams had the authority to issue it, and he said that the guy was entitled to it and that he should receive the commission. But then Marshall said he wasn't going to issue the mandamus, basically an order to do your duty, in order to do something to the Jefferson administration. He wasn't going to do it because in the Judiciary Act of 1789, which basically started off the court system. So if you remember back into in the Constitution when the Supreme Court was created, and we do have some slides, we'll see on that in a second, but it didn't tell you a whole lot about, it didn't really get into specifics, but it does talk about, all judicial power will be vested in one Supreme Court and other federal courts as Congress may establish. But it didn't really say what those vested powers were. Well, the Judiciary Act of 1789 did several things. It established federal courts, lower federal courts. It established schedules of when they would meet, that was kind of a staggered meeting date. And it also identified what those powers were. So it wasn't, when you say judicial power, the Congress had to spell out what those powers were. The courts don't just get to make it up. Congress had to spell out what their powers were. Well, they also laid out the type of jurisdiction. Now, if you remember, there's original jurisdiction that the Supreme Court has, and then there's appellate. Well, in the Judiciary Act of 1789, they primarily just allowed the federal government, the Supreme Court, they had obviously their original jurisdiction, but they only had appellate jurisdiction for issues that were part of their original jurisdiction. So they didn't have appellate jurisdiction for anything and everything. And actually, they allowed state courts to hear federal issues, even original jurisdiction issues. They allowed them to hear them, but if there was concern over the ruling, then it could be appealed to the Supreme Court. So, for instance, if a state Supreme Court said a state law was allowable and was not a violation of an original power given, and the federal government had concerns with that, they would appeal it. The Supreme Court would still make a ruling on that. So they still had appellate jurisdiction for original, but they didn't. They basically just had appellate jurisdiction for the original powers. And let me clarify. These would be powers under Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. All right. Let me go ahead here and get into some of these slides. This might help a little bit better. So the first slide, delegated federal powers. All right. Article 1, Section 8. So when you hear original jurisdiction, think delegated federal powers. Those are the areas that the Supreme Court is going to have original jurisdiction. These are things under Article 1, Section 8. And in some cases, there could be concurrent jurisdiction. But the bottom line is, these are the areas that were delegated, and if there's any opposition by the federal government on these, and you're going to lose on these, or these are the powers delegated, Article 1, Section 8. And then, of course, Article 1, Section 10, those were the things that the states could not do. And they correlate with the delegated powers of Article 1, Section 8. Okay, so they lay out Article 1, Section 8, here's things the federal government can do. Article 1, Section 10, here's things the states can't do, and those things correlate. Okay, let's go ahead and cover the Supremacy Clause real quick here. All right, and it says, this Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof. That's a key phrase, made in pursuance thereof. Not just any old law, but those made in accordance with the Constitution. And all treaties made, or which shall be made, under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land, and the judges in every state shall be bound thereby, anything in the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary notwithstanding. And we'll go to slide 3, Bill of Rights. Now, if you remember, although the Constitution, at the end of the Constitutional Convention in 1787, there was a push for a Bill of Rights. It was rejected, so no Bill of Rights was added at the end, but then they had to get it ratified. And it became necessary to promise in the first session of Congress to bring up the Bill of Rights. In a lot of states, when they ratified ratified the Constitution, they included suggestions for the Bill of Rights. And so the first Congress comes around, and yes, Madison brought those forth. They became the Bill of Rights. And all of that came about because people were very concerned that they were creating a federal government that was going to be too powerful. And that was what the whole push for a Bill of Rights was all about. All right, so I want to, and of course, the Bill of Rights are the first 10 amendments, but I want to hit the 9th Amendment and 10th Amendment specifically because those are really pertinent to this. So the 9th Amendment says, the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. Translation, if there's any rights discovered down the road that we don't know about, they belong to the states and the people, not the federal government. The next slide is the 10th Amendment. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution or prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. All right, so you've got Article 1, Section 8 that tells you what the federal government has the power to do. Article 1, Section 10 specifies what state can't do. 9th Amendment, anything not enumerated belongs to the states or the people. 10th Amendment, anything in powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution or prohibited by the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. So if there's anything discovered down the line, if there's any power unaccounted for, it should belong with the states and not the federal government. Now, during both the ratification of all the states, one of the concerns was the Supremacy Clause, which I read earlier. People were concerned about that. And that had a lot to do with the Bill of Rights being requested, being basically insisted on, and especially the 9th and 10th Amendments. Now, another clause that caused them concern, the judicial power, was the judicial power. This is for setting up the courts. I apologize here, I got a little. All right, here we go. Judicial power of the United States shall be vested in one Supreme Court and in such inferior courts as the Congress may from time to time ordain and establish. The judges both of the Supreme and inferior courts shall hold their office during good behavior and shall at all times stated receive for their services a compensation which shall not be diminished during their continuance in office. Now, okay, so good behavior. Now, I know that the Democrats now, Biden administration, the Harris administration, the Obama administration, whatever you want to call it, we know that they're not happy that the Supreme Court is not ruling their way all the time. Think about it. Most of the gains that the Democrats have made over the years have been through the courts. The courts have probably perverted the Constitution more than any other branch of government. Okay? Not that the other two, and especially, and you'll see here in a little bit, the Congress is complicit with that as well. But the courts have done a lot of perverting. But even though we've seen some improvement under the Trump appointees and some even before that, now they're not playing the left's game all the time, so the left wants to change the rules in terms of they want to pack the court. They want these ethics, they want to create a code of ethics for the judges. Well, basically they want to create a code of ethics so they can find a way to throw them out. But this says good behavior, okay? And unless it's an impeachable offense, you can't just make up a code of ethics and try to throw them out for that, okay? That's going to take that, and there's two things here that were done at the time so that the judiciary would have some independence, okay? In the past, they really didn't have any independence with, in Europe in general. Now, we didn't have a court under the Articles of Confederation, so just keep that in mind. But two of the safeguards for the judiciary were you couldn't just get rid of them. It had to be an impeachable offense, and we know how hard that is, and that has not happened much in our history. And your compensation couldn't change while you're in office. And that was also that they couldn't be, under the thumb of the Congress or the executive. Although the Congress, as we'll talk about here in a minute, still has a lot of control. We don't have three equal branches, and we'll talk about that in a minute. All right, so they receive for their services, okay, not be diminished during their continuance in office. And then Section 2, the judicial power shall extend in all cases in law and equity arising under this Constitution to the laws of the United States and treaties made or which shall be made under their authority to all cases affecting ambassadors, other public ministers, and consuls, to all cases of admiralty and maritime jurisdiction, to controversies which the United States shall be a party, to controversies between two or more states, between a state and citizen of another state, which, by the way, the 11th Amendment changed that. And let's see, between citizens of the same state claiming land grants under different states, and between a state or citizens thereof and foreign states, citizens or subjects. In all cases affecting ambassadors and other public ministers and consuls, and that which the state shall be party, the Supreme Court shall have original jurisdiction. Now, it's a fairly small list of their original jurisdiction. In all other cases before mentioned, the Supreme Court shall have appellate jurisdiction, both as to law and fact, with such exceptions and under such regulations as the Congress shall make. Okay, so Congress controls the jurisdiction. Okay, the Supreme Court will always have original jurisdiction, but Congress can seriously limit their appellate jurisdiction for both the Supreme Court and all the federal courts. As a matter of fact, there's nothing that requires us to have any federal courts other than Supreme Court. You don't have to. I mean, if they wanted to, they could get rid of all the federal courts. They're not going to do that, but they could get rid of them all. They could seriously restrict their jurisdiction. In fact, in 1789, the Judiciary Act of 1789, as I said earlier, they only gave appellate jurisdiction to the Supreme Court for those things that are found in Article 1, Section 8. Okay, that was that in their original jurisdiction. They had appellate jurisdiction for that, but not just anything and everything. So the Congress can seriously limit their appellate jurisdiction. If you think about it, a lot of the problems we've had in this country over the years have been fights over things that fell under their appellate jurisdiction. Not so much original, not to say there are not issues with original jurisdiction. And there certainly could be in the future with some of the treaties that are being proposed. And I don't know if we'll have time to talk about that tonight or not. All right, so they can limit their jurisdiction. Another thing to remember, and we're going to see this here in Federal 78 in a second. So Federal 78, we'll go ahead and put that up there. Now, Federal 78, if you remember, during the ratification process, the Federalist Papers, they were mostly written for a New York audience. We use them today because they give a pretty good overview of how the Constitution, we are told, was supposed to work. But remember, the Federalist Papers are a reaction to the criticism of the Anti-Federalists. The Anti-Federalists were afraid, hey, look, we're just recreating a monster we fought to get rid of. And it's going to be right here. So that's a lot of the things they were concerned about was the Supremacy Clause, the Supreme Court, the powers of the Supreme Court, the General Welfare Clause. Those were things that really concerned them. Now, in Federalist 78, and you'll hear a lot of people that are all about the court, they'll point to Federalist 78. And yes, Federalist 78 does lay out where the court, will hear cases and make decisions, and they try to present it as if, the court is going to protect us from an out-of-control executive or an out-of-control Congress, and that they'll be there to protect us. Well, first off, remember, they should only be practicing the powers they have, Article 1, Section 8, okay? It should be limited, all right? That's what it's supposed to be. But if we start with what I put up here on Federal 78, if you'll stick the slide up there, and you'll see, it points out that the court should be the least dangerous branch of government because it does not have the sword of the executive, does not have the power of the purse. It's dependent on the executive to put into action any opinion it comes up with. It has judgment only, which that judgment is an opinion. Okay? If you make a statement and you don't have the sword and you don't have the purse, and the people with the sword and the purse don't agree, then it's not going to happen. Now, most of the time they go along with it. We have built the court up, this insane idea that we have three co-equal branches. No, we don't. If we had three co-equal branches, the Supreme Court would be able to throw people out of Congress. Can they do that? No. But technically, according to the Constitution, the Congress can impeach and remove people on the court. The Congress can cut the budget of the court. The Congress can take away all their appellate jurisdiction. The Congress can do away with or reduce the number of federal courts. It can limit their appellate jurisdiction. In fact, some federal courts have appellate jurisdiction for just specific things. But remember, whatever power they have in that court, whether you're talking the federal court, the Supreme Court, the powers they have are approved, given to them by the Congress. So we don't have three equal branches. We build them up as being three equal branches, and we build the court up as this branch that looks out for the little guy and defends our rights. But if you've paid attention for like the last 50 years, it should be pretty obvious to you they're one of the main culprits for the situation our country is in now. But having said that, and remember what I just said about Congress having this ability to limit their jurisdiction, they generally speaking have chosen not to. Now, in the 1990s, they did do some federal prison reform, and in some of that federal prison reform, they restricted the appellate jurisdiction of the court. Same thing after 9/11 with the Patriot Act and some other things. I'm not touting the Patriot Act, okay? I'm not touting the things that came out of that. I'm just saying, as far as what the Constitution allows, the Congress can severely limit their jurisdiction, especially their appellate jurisdiction. I wish they would. I really wish they would. I think that would be an improvement if their jurisdiction was. Now, we might be getting some good decisions out of the current Supreme Court, and I've heard some people, why would we want to do that now? Well, you may like a decision that comes down, but I can tell you, we're in the situation we're in because of federal overreach and federal involvement of the court in places it has no business. The federal government has no role in marriage. So how is it the Supreme Court ruled that gay marriage was the law of the land? Same thing with abortion. Telling us in the 60s, early 60s, hey, your kids can't pray in school. Now, I'd be scared to have kids pray in school today because who knows what in some of these schools, they would be praying too. But the point is, that's not the place of the federal government. All the way we do it right now, with this acceptance of this being our system, and the federal courts and the Supreme Court get to make all the decisions, that means all of the rights we supposedly have, they're not rights. They're just privileges waiting to be taken. And so this has been a problem. It'll continue to be a problem as long as we allow it to be a problem. And one of the things we can do at the federal level is we should insist, and I did send a text to my rep the other day, to restrict the appellate jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. That's what we need to do. Now, obviously, it's got to be worded just right. We want to look at this, but things that if it's supposed to be a state power, if it's a power that's clearly a state power, in other words, it's not a power delegated to the federal government, it is therefore a state power, then our Congress should restrict the appellate jurisdiction of the court on those issues. That's what needs to happen. That won't happen unless a lot of people start pushing for that. But that should be something every time, it's still an election season. When you see you're elected, the candidates running, you need to hit them up with that. We want you to limit the appellate jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. It's in the Constitution. It's been done. Like I said, the First Judiciary Act, it very much limited it. Give you another reason why we need to do it. I don't know if you saw, but in Blount County the other day, if you remember a year or two ago, our state passed a law against the drag shows in Tennessee. I mean, it's in certain situations. Well, now a federal court has overturned that, saying we can't, they're saying, no, we can't do that. You can't stop them. They're telling our state that we can't protect kids from drag shows. That's not the role of the court. If that's our system, if that's the system the founders gave us, then maybe we don't have as much to thank them for as I thought we did. I think that's a perversion of the system our founders gave us. Of course, I don't think the founders ever anticipated that our Congress would be as pathetic as it is. And I'm sure that they never anticipated, and you'll know this if you read any of the Federalist Papers where they make all these references to, well, hey, the states will step in. The states would never allow it, and of course I'm paraphrasing. I don't think they ever anticipated our governors and our state legislatures being as uninformed about the Constitution, and in many cases being either too cowardly to say anything or just complicit. But that's what it comes down to. So that is one thing we can do at the federal level, is push our elected reps and our senators to restrict the appellate jurisdiction of the federal courts, Supreme Court and all. All right, let me see, slide down here. Functions, dangerous to political rights to the Constitution. Okay, so this is, all right, that was Federal 78. I think you already popped that up on there. But it made the point that the court would be the least dangerous because it didn't have sword, it didn't have the purse, and then of course the states would step up on that. Now let me scroll down here and see. Okay, the next slide. All right, let's go back to the first slide of Marbury versus Madison. All right, now, so if you look up, on the internet, you look up Marbury versus Madison or John Marshall or Judicial Review, you're going to get this statement. And this is from John Marshall. This is from the case. It is emphatically the province and duty of the judicial department to say what the law is. Those who apply the rule to particular cases must of necessity expound and interpret that rule. If two laws conflict with each other, the courts must decide on the operation of each. Okay, now the big thing that the part that they focus on is it is emphatically the province and duty of the judicial department to say what the law is. Sometimes that will be the only quote you see when you look up it. You may not see the full quote. So, province and duty. I would agree it's their duty. They are a court, they're going to. And then in terms of province, if you mean that exclusively, and that no matter what you come up with, no matter how bad you pervert or distort the Constitution, or ignore it altogether and refer to something else, some penumbra or emanations, I think is what they referred to in Roe v. Wade way back, then no, you shouldn't be the final word, okay? Neither the executive branch or the legislative branch or the states, especially if it has to do with something that's a state power, should say, oh, well, the Supreme Court has spoken. We just have to bow down and kiss the ring and do whatever they say. Now, I don't, that is why we're in the mess we're in. Anyway, back to the case just a little bit so that this makes a little more sense to you. All right, like I said, don't forget the political aspects of it. These were opposing sides. Marshall should have been a witness in the case, not the judge of it. All right? And he knew that if he just told Jefferson or Madison, hey, give him the commission, that he'd be told to pound sand. Now, Marshall was very much someone who wanted a strong central government, okay? Now, hats off to the guy in the Revolution. He fought in the Revolution. He was with Washington and Valley Forge. Kudos on all of that. He always saw himself as an American, as if the 13 colonies, 13 states were all one, okay? That's not the way a lot of people saw themselves at that time and for decades to come. Okay, you remember we had a civil war because people definitely had more loyalty to their states. I'm not saying that's the only reason, but there was a lot of people, they were going to go with their state. Their state was their country, all right? And so that was how a lot of people saw it. He saw it as this is all one country. So you have conflicting views on that as well. You have him and the other Federalists who want this strong central government. You have those on the other side who want a limited government. They're afraid of a strong, overpowering central government. That's what they just fought against, all right? So instead of just telling him to give the commission and knowing he would be ignored, he said that the law in 1789 that authorized the Supreme Court under its original jurisdiction to deliver the mandamus, and I am probably messing this up. This part is not super important. Essentially, he said the law was unconstitutional. Now, there are those who think that he distorted the statute, distorted the actual law in order to make his bigger point. His bigger point, of which I agree with his bigger point, whether this case met that criteria or not is a whole other question. His bigger point was anything that if it's a violation of the Constitution, it's unconstitutional. Unconstitutional laws are null and void. Okay, that the Congress can't just make something up. That the Congress could not pass a law that's unconstitutional and expect the judges to go along with it. Well, and of course that would work both ways, I would think. If the Congress can't have a law that's unconstitutional and expect the judges to go along with it, can the judges pass an opinion, make a judgment, and expect the Congress and the executive to go along with it? I would say no. I would include the states in that. So if Congress can't make an unconstitutional law and expect the court to bless off on it, then the court can't make an unconstitutional ruling or give an opinion and expect the Congress, the executive, or the states to go along with it. If you take what he says, it's emphatically the province and duty of the Judicial Department to say what the law is, which in later court case, I think it was Cooper versus Aarons in 1958, that said they referred back to this case, and they basically just said, we are the final arbiter. What we say is constitutional, or what we say is the Constitution. That's making the rule of men preeminent over the rule of law. And of course, in recent decades, we've been ruled by men and women on the court versus the rule of law. But that's how it's been taken. If the court says it, we have to do it. That's garbage. And I'm going to read down through some other things he said. Now, I don't know that he was actually, in this case, trying to make that claim that they were the only arbiter or that their word was. But if you look at his later cases, he was all about establishing a strong central government. All right, so let's slide down here just a little bit. Okay. Those who apply the rule to a particular case must of necessity expound and interpret the rule. If two laws conflict, okay, the courts must decide. All right, now let's go to the next slide. The powers of the legislature. This is still the same opinion. This is John Marshall. The powers of the legislature are defined and limited, and that these limits may not be mistaken or forgotten. The Constitution is written. To what purpose are powers limited? And to what purpose is that limitation committed in writing? If these limits may at any time be passed by those intended to be restrained. That makes perfect sense. Congress should not be able to pass those limits. Same thing for the court. Same thing for the executive. You know, if an executive, if we resent it when we hear Biden say, or Harris, that they're going to do something we know they don't have the authority to do. We don't accept it from the Congress. We complain about that. But somehow, just because it's the judiciary, it's the Supreme Court, we're going to let them make stuff up or distort and pervert the plain language? I don't think so. This distinction between a government with limited and unlimited powers is abolished if those limits do not confine the persons on whom they are imposed, and if acts prohibited and acts allowed are of equal obligation. Once again, makes sense. Next slide. This is the last statement in the decision. These are the last statements in the decision, and there's some other additional statements that we'll cover as much time as we have, okay? It is also not entirely unworthy of observance that, declaring what shall be the supreme law of the land, the Constitution itself is first mentioned, and not the laws of the United States generally. I want to read that again, because I know some of you have heard this before. It is also not entirely unworthy of observation that in declaring what shall be the supreme law of the land, the Constitution itself is first mentioned, and not the laws of the United States generally, but those only which shall be made in pursuance of the Constitution have that rank. Those only that shall be made in pursuance of the Constitution have that rank. We hear all the time, I know at least in the last 6 months, 2 different opinions of our AG where he's made the comment, well, federal law trumps, and this is my paraphrase, that federal law trumps all state law. And you hear it all the time. Most of the lawyers will tell you that. 99% of the lawyers will tell you that. 99% of the judges will tell you that. You know, the cult of federal supremacy is huge, guys. We are the minority. But that's what they will tell you. Well, they constantly cite Marbury versus Madison so that they can read the part about it being emphatically the duty and the province and duty of the courts to say what the law is. But they somehow, because I've never heard them mention this part, because they also always say federal law trumps state law. They almost always say that. But I don't hear them saying this part. I don't hear them saying that it's laws made in pursuance thereof. But it's in the same decision. So the next time when somebody tells you, especially if it's a lawyer, especially if it's an elected official, hey, I don't care if it's the AG. Tell them, well, hey, it says in Marbury versus Madison that law is in pursuance of. Not just any law is the supreme law of the land. So I don't think it's any accident. I can't imagine that all these lawyers for all these years, I know they know about this. There's no way they don't know about it. But what does the federal supremacist cult harp on? They harp on duty of the court to say what the law is. That's what they do. But in this very same decision, I'm going to read a few other things. I got a few minutes here. I'm going to hit a few other things that he said. So ultimately, as far as the case goes, he did not issue the mandamus. He said the law was unconstitutional and we're not going to bless off on it. That's what he said. Now, he didn't have the force to make, he couldn't have forced them anyway, because remember, if he told them to do it, it'd be just like Andrew Jackson told Marshall later in reference to the Indian Removal Act, which I don't necessarily agree with the Indian Removal Act. However, Marshall ruled in favor of the Indians, and what did Jackson tell him? Okay, Marshall made his decision, now let him enforce it. That's a reference back to the fact the court has neither sword nor purse. So remember, when the court puts something on us that's egregious, that's outrageous, like gay marriage, like abortion, these other things, they do it with the complicity of the Congress, and they do it with the complicity of our state. And I remember in 2015 when the Obergefell decision or opinion came down, our state just folded, boom, just like that. Just like that. Hour and a half, it was done. All because Bill Haslam didn't want to fight it. Bill Haslam said, yeah, we're going to go along with this. And everybody folded. Now, Bruin, the decision about guns, about the Second Amendment 2 years ago, I like the opinion. They're still dragging their feet on that. They're still dragging their feet in the state of Tennessee on that. And the federal government. You would think that something would have been brought up by now if they were sincere about following this idea. Why do we even have an ATF? Why do we still have an ATF? How can anything the ATF does in relation to guns be constitutional based on what was said in the Bruin decision, if the courts are the final arbiter? So they pick and choose. And from what I've seen in my lifetime, if it's perverted, if it's wrong, if it's something that gives the federal government more power, boom, they'll enforce it in no time flat. They're all on board. If it's something that decent people want, something that's obviously constitutional, obviously right, they fight it. They drag their feet. That's what I've seen. All right, so let me slide down. I want to read you a few other things because he said a lot of good things in this. Let's see. Have that. Okay. Thus, the particular phraseology of the Constitution of the United States confirms and strengthens the principle, supposed to be essential to all written constitutions, that a law repugnant to the Constitution is void, and that courts as well as other departments are bound by that instrument, meaning the Constitution. The courts as well as other departments. Okay, I would think that would mean the states as well, right? Okay, that's what it means. Do we need the court to tell us when something is it only unconstitutional because the court says it? That's insane. That everybody, if the president, a decent president, could see something is obviously unconstitutional, he took an oath to the Constitution. He didn't take an oath to the Supreme Court. He didn't take an oath to the Supreme Court opinions. Why do we even take oaths if we're going to let the Supreme Court decide everything? I mean, really, shouldn't you be updating your oath every time we have a Supreme Court decision? It's ridiculous. Everybody that takes an oath, they take an oath to defend the Constitution as they understand it. And they should fight for what they understand. And they're bound by that instrument. So when our state sees the federal government doing something unconstitutional, we should fight against it. We should say, we're not going to do that here. Other examples of what the Supreme Court said. Let's see, what the Supreme Court said, laws are null or void. Let's see, these are some more statements from the very decision. It's a proposition too plain to be contested that the Constitution controls any legislative act repugnant to it, or that the legislature may alter the Constitution by an ordinary act. So you can't change the Constitution just by passing a law. You have to do a constitutional amendment to change it. Between these alternatives, there is no middle ground. The Constitution is either a superior paramount law, unchangeable by ordinary means, or it is on a level with ordinary legislative acts, and like other acts, is alterable when the legislature so please to alter it. If the former part of the alternative be true, then a legislative act contrary to the Constitution is not law. If the latter part be true, then written Constitution are absurd attempts on the part of the people to limit a power in its own nature, unlimitable. Certainly, all those who have framed written constitutions contemplate them as forming the fundamental and paramount law of the nation, and consequently the theory of every such government must be that an act of the legislature or the court or the executive repugnant, and those, I'm saying those last two, repugnant to the Constitution is void. This theory is essentially attached to a written Constitution, is consequently to be considered by this court as one of the fundamental principles of our society. It is not therefore to be lost sight of, I'm sorry, I'm having some vision issues again, the further consideration of this subject. If an act of the legislature repugnant to the Constitution is void, does notwithstanding its invalidity, bind the courts and oblige them to give it effect? So he's basically saying the same thing different ways. If it's unconstitutional, it's unenforceable, it's void. It's void for the court, it's void for the legislature. Makes sense to me that it would be void for the state. My issue is, I don't think the court saying it is unconstitutional, we don't have to wait for that. If you see something that is clearly, if our state knows, for instance, the marriage thing, we should just have avoided that. We should, no, we're not playing along. Hey, we even had a constitutional amendment in our state. Pick a topic, Second Amendment. We should just say, you know what? These things are just patently unconstitutional. I know this sounds extreme, but guys, look out there what's going on in our country. And it's only going to get worse. I don't know how we're going to stop the Democrats from stealing the election. But in any event, even if we get Trump in there, he's going to be a leaky tourniquet. He can only fix so much and he won't be there long. Our states have to push back. We have to force them. They're not going to do it on their own. Let me see if there's anything here that's really different that you need to hear. It's not just something that I've said that's already worded different. He does that. He repeats himself worse than I do. So judicial department, blah, 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 blah. Yeah, okay, pretty much all the same thing. I would encourage you to go read the Marbury versus Madison decision. Now, if you want to read the particulars about the commissions, the undelivered commissions, and all of the stuff that he goes, that's all fine and well. But the meat of it, what's important about it is when he said, hey, look, this is unconstitutional, and then the argument he makes from there, with the exception of the implication that only the courts can make these decisions, which he didn't say that directly, okay? He didn't say it as directly as later courts have said it, okay? But once again, if that's the case, we're not a nation of laws, we're a nation of men. They just happen to be men, well, men and women in robes. That just turns our whole Constitution on its head. You know, we don't really have rights and freedoms recognized by the Constitution. We just have privileges waiting to be taken away from us. So we really need to rethink this. We need to no longer accept this garbage about it. Unconstitutional laws are void. That's the bottom line. And we need to encourage and force somehow our state to stand up for that. Now remember, we are going to have at some point in time in the not too distant future, there is supposed to be summer session on the nullification bill. We have a lot of information about that. We don't have a date yet on that, but there's going to be one coming out soon. And so, but you need to encourage your state legislator and your state senator to support nullification. We need to push from both ends. We need to have our U.S. rep and our U.S. senator let the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court, of the appellate jurisdiction, and we need at the state level to push for nullification. So those are my thoughts for tonight on that. I do have a few announcements here for you, and let me get down there to it. I've got a lot of information on here. I'm not going to have time to cover all of it, but once again, just go online and just type in Marbury versus Madison. I know that Justia and some other sites, they'll list the whole thing. You can read it for yourself. And it's a good thing to do, so you'll have a little better idea. But like I said, most of what I read in there, with the exception of one or two things that he says, I think, number one, it confirms, hey, the Constitution is the law of the land. It didn't say the court's the law of the land. It said the Constitution is the law of the land. And said that that's, you can't support something that's unconstitutional. And said that not all, the other big thing is that not all federal laws are the law of the land, only those in pursuance thereof, which means they have to be in concurrence with the Constitution. And so I have got a lot of information on here I'm having to scroll down through because I've run out of time. I know I jumped around a little bit. I hope you're able to follow along, but I do think that if you just go and read it for yourself, and you should do that with some other decisions too, because there's other things that we're told and we're not getting the whole story. So they may say, well, this decision said that. Matter of fact, if you watched this show a while back, back in March, when we had Jeff Cobble on, after the AG's opinion came out. Well, the AG's opinion listed certain cases to make certain points. Well, Jeff went and actually read the whole opinion. And some of the points that were cited, if you read further in that same opinion, contradicts the point that the AG tried to make. So just keep that in mind. I want to thank all of you for taking the time to watch our program tonight. Please be sure to hit the like and subscribe buttons, as well as the notification bell, so you never miss an episode. It really goes a long way to keep us on the air, bring you to the program. We appreciate your support. Check out our audio podcast on iHeartRadio, Spotify, and other platforms as well. Sign up for our weekly newsletter at our website, teeninformer.com. And you can find or follow us on X and on Facebook. The Institute on the Constitution, speaking of the Constitution, is presenting a 12-week course on the Constitution titled An American View of Law, Liberty, and Government, Restoring the Constitutional Republic Through Grassroots Education. Hosts are Brian and Robin Gregg. You can email them at us.constitution.class@gmail.com, or you can call them at 931-839-7776. Location is 15 West Rhea Street, Sparta, Tennessee. Class hours are from 6 to 7:30 p.m. and they start tomorrow. The class starts tomorrow. Next Saturday, the 7th, Tennessee Firearms Association will hold its annual fundraiser at the Farm Bureau Expo Center, located at James E. Ward Ag Center, 945 East Batter Parkway. Lebanon, Tennessee. Order your tickets online at tflac.org/2024 annual event, TennesseeFirearms.com. This year's speakers are Pete Hedspeth of Fox News, Representative Mark Green, and Gun Owners of America VP Eric Pratt Sr. Visit the site for more details. Our guest next week will be Andrea Gomez, here to discuss proposed state legislation to fight abuses by the FBI in Tennessee. Hope you'll join us. That's it for now, and good night from Paris, Tennessee, that is.